Go watch a trailer. Every single thing that you are watching right there is in fact data. And the way that that was made in its supply chain was driven by data.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Datamasters podcast from Tamer. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm sitting with Mark Marinelli, the head of product at Tamer, who's going to introduce the subject and the guest of today's episode. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Nate. So not many people think of media and entertainment as an industry that is run by data. We think about Hollywood, we think about movies, actors, scripts. There's a ton of unstructured data there for sure. But as organizations try to leverage their data for competitive advantage, capturing mind share, et cetera, we don't really think of that facet of the media and entertainment industry. But the reality is that behind the scenes, there's a huge infrastructure of very complex supply chain of data that helps shape what trailers you watch, what gets shown in your local theater, and what date these blockbusters are going to be released on. So today we've got Eric Iverson, former CIO and CTO at the top talent agency, Creative Artists Agency, or CAA. He's going to take us on a whirlwind tour of all of the different facets of this data supply chain in the media and entertainment industry and talk about how Hollywood has historically leveraged their data and some of the more recent advancements they've made in being able to drive really interesting outcomes with the data that they are constantly collecting from us, their consumers.
Let's get to it then. Here is Eric Iverson. Eric, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. So I'm so glad to be here today. I love this topic of data. I started working on data probably very heavily back in 1996. Not counting all the work we do in college, of course, but when I was working at Accenture, which was Anderson Consulting at the time, and started working on my first analytics project back then, and I kind of got hooked on it. As the years moved forward, I eventually moved over to Sony Pictures, and pretty early on, really back in 2001, got very heavily involved in all of our data projects, basically digital and data projects. And the reason for that was the industry was about ready to go into a major shift. I was working on some of the strategy projects then, and two things were pretty obvious to all of us in the industry. One is that the industry was going to transform to all digital workflows. Or if you think about that, all data workflows. And the second is that it was going to be data that was going to drive those digital workflows. And we used to talk back then, which you could understand now, which is if you can imagine if all of your product is digital and everything that you're moving is all of these digital assets around, but none of it was described, you have a lot of assets that you can't find anywhere, and you wouldn't be able to move them around. So that's when I got pretty heavily involved in all of our core data projects at Sony Pictures, and really pretty much that was most of my career at Sony was kind of focused on data and digital. Eventually becoming the CIO for Sony Pictures Television, and then moved over to CAA in 2016, and similar kind of opportunity, which was great to kind of be able to take some of those learnings and then move them upstream with a very talented team that I ended up having the good fortune to get to work with, and have continued to do that in the industry. In between, have been involved in a lot of the industry initiatives in and around data, which we'll talk about in a second. We talk a little bit about how media and entertainment works.
So entertainment isn't the first industry that people think of when they think of big data. Take us through it then. In what ways are you leveraging big data and analytics?
Yeah, such a great question. I think that a couple things, one for the listeners would be simply let's ground ourselves. If you were out there right now not driving and listening to this, I would say take 1 second, pause this podcast, and go watch a trailer and your favorite film coming up. And as you're interacting with that trailer, I want you to think about the fact that every single thing that you are watching right there is in fact data. And the way that that was made in its supply chain was driven by data. In media and entertainment today, our product is 100% data at the end of the day. And that's the way it is today. But that's not the industry's relationship with data goes way back. And if anything, it's one of the industries that we've loved data about for a long time, but we never really have thought about it that way. So if you go back all the way in history, we started tracking box office as kind of like a box score in a baseball game back in 1922. And this has been really important benchmarks for the way that we start to measure how everything works in our industry. And, you keep moving forward on that. Very, very soon after the invention of television, we started doing things like Nielsen ratings and being able to do audience measurement. And all of these things were kind of the box scores and really understanding kind of what our audiences wanted. So for a long time in the history of media and entertainment, we've been enamored with data. All of the studios have always had research groups that have been very focused on that and pulling data and understanding what audiences like and don't like, and using that information to actually market the film and even alter production. One of my favorite films of all time, because I'm a baseball player, is The Natural. And to give you an idea of how much of an impact actually data can have or research can have into that is the entire film, The Natural, the ending was rewritten based on research and data. They went out and did panels and discovered that people didn't like the sad ending that was based on the original book. And so they actually rewrote it to a happy ending, and it's now known. I mean, I don't think anyone could watch the movie The Natural and not imagine the happy ending at the end of The Natural. But if you went back and read the book, that's not how that story ends. So we've had a very tight relationship with data a long time. You start moving into our digital age, and all of a sudden now you find it pervasive pretty much across the entire industry.
Right. Nowadays, I imagine that because, the entertainment industry is so big, you must have so many different players, lots of stakeholders and data silos that may not have been made interoperable with one another. How do you get diverse data silos to work together, and what good can come from doing so?
Such a good question. I think, you start looking at the supply chain, and you hit the nail on the head, which is that it is an industry with a lot of players in it. So we have all these players, and kind of by analogy, we have supply chains that kind of have to move from phase to phase. So if I took it at a high level, you would say, great, for those companies that are at the beginning of this process, like a CAA, they're interested in trying to figure out what are all the opportunities out there that we can match make. They're either creating opportunities or they're matchmaking opportunities with the world's greatest talent. That's kind of one example of that. And so you can imagine their part of the supply chain is the simple question of what are all the opportunities? And if you ask that question on a global scale, that's a pretty difficult question to answer. Imagine that, like, what are all of the opportunities to potentially produce something for all the audiences on planet Earth, and where are the talent and where are the opportunities? So that's kind of a difficult question to answer. The CAA has these amazing relationships, and that's one of the things that it does incredibly well. So obviously tracking all of that and making sure that they have the best information is really important. But in today's world, that's moving so quickly with so many productions and entertainment opportunities, being able to track that on a global scale and matching that against your talent is super important to be able to be that organized. So that's kind of the first thing. And you can imagine there's data providers out there that provide some insights into that that you can get from different places, and you have to glean that. So an example might be, coming out of the U.S., but going into some, let's say, European territories, you might have to start tracking things like asking the question of like, great, who's been producing some really interesting film or pictures in some territories across the world on some smaller channels that are becoming bigger as that opportunity grows. And so you would, instead of just sending scores of human beings out there, you also might be able to leverage some data sources to start understanding that. Then once you finally get all of that packaged up so that you can get people together and produce things, you move into production. This is where it gets so much more complicated than I think most people understand. The production process in and of itself has two things that make it hard. One is that there's so many components to that, and today it's gotten a lot more complicated. And in addition to that, the stakes are higher, and we're trying to drive the timelines down as quickly as possible. Think of it as like a manufacturing supply chain. But what does that look like in storytelling? And in the storytelling business, you have stories that you have to kind of start off with, but then you're having to assemble all of your teams, and you're storyboarding things, and you have to figure out your set design, and you have to go find locations for places, and then you're going to cast and try to get the right casting for all of these. These are all things that are happening kind of early on in this kind of pre-production leading into production. And as you can imagine, each one of these things has lots of data behind it. If you went to any of the studios, you're going to find that like Sony would have, they're going to have an entire library of what they have for costumes. There's costume databases, and they have location databases for kind of where all these things could be shot in different locations. You have props and everything else that you can imagine that you could use into a production. That is just now the tip of the iceberg. As we've moved into digital production, now you start having all kind of this visual effects. You have lots of shots, and because you can imagine, what do you think happened when all of a sudden digital photography came out compared to film photography? We got a lot more footage than we ever had before. So when we had film photography, you could shoot a shot during the day, and it's going to cost you a decent amount of money because you're paying for the film. But once the price of actually shooting on live film almost vanished, and now we're just down to hard drive space, the cost of shooting lots and lots and lots and lots of footage, when that went through the floor, the amount of content we produced went through the ceiling. And so now we have so much more content in the production process than we ever had before. And then now you're trying to layer that on in workflows with kind of visual effects and all of the editing work. And then, as you can imagine, as we're going to lead into distribution, the marketing teams want access to material earlier and earlier and earlier. And your audience sees this. I mean, how many people, whether it was Star Wars, imagine your last big film that came out last year. You don't want to see a theatrical trailer. You get teased with an early theatrical trailer. And then you somewhat expect that pretty soon they're going to have another one that's even better, and then another one that's even better. That's your marketing teams trying to get access to the production material as soon as they possibly can. And when those shots are a composite of, live film and editorial and visual effects, trying to actually get into that right content that has the right access, boy, that can be quite a challenge. And for the listeners out there, this is all driven these days largely with data, because data and metadata for all of these assets that are going through these workflows, these things are actually defined. They're like access control is defined by data. So the question is like, great, I just shot 35 shots of this one scene. But two of them are the ones that are interesting. So we don't want people looking at all of the other 34. We want them to look at the two that are out there. Well, what's defining that metadata about the shot? So we need the right data moving through those supply chains. And later on, there may be all of these other legal clearance questions that are going on. So legally, is this something we can use in marketing or not? Or if you have big talent that is on a production, can they or can they not be able to intervene, and do they have a say in whether or not that gets used? So these are all things that actually happen intra-supply chain. That's just in production. And then you finally get over into kind of distribution. And imagine now, I'm going to simplify all this. Someone has now dropped off the final package, and I'm going to oversimplify this because it plays out more complicated in media entertainment supply chains. But imagine this final product gets up, and it's like, great, ta-da! Here's Star Trek 20, and we've just produced it for the United States, and the whole thing was shot. All the actors spoke English, and we're done. Well, as you can imagine, you're not going to distribute that just in the United States. You're going to do distribution everywhere in the world where possibly you have Star Trek fans. So if you're going to basically take that finished product, you now have to consider, I need to have that available in every language in the world. Does that mean I have dubbing in every language in the world? Am I doing subtitling for every language in the world? And do I have assets and marketing assets? And when the opening scene comes up and it lists the title of the film, what's that going to be? Because I could tell you right now, Spider-Man isn't Spider-Man in every country of the world. The word doesn't even mean anything in some places. So all of these films have to have unique titles everywhere in the world where they're shot, which means they're going to have unique assets tied to each one of these things. And so just one film is going to be super complex. I'll use the original Spider-Man because we did some very specific asset analysis. Just for that original film, in major components, not all the small minor components that you would do in visual effects, but on the major components, like, hey, the film titles changed. We have this trailer, had over 3,000 core assets just to composite into the film in distribution. And so you add all of that up. Now you have to have all this metadata and data that's tied to each one of these assets so that, imagine if your goal is that I'm delivering Spider-Man into Spain and I need to give them all the right Spanish metadata and they need to have all the right Spanish assets and they need the right cut of that film, that version of the film that actually has the Spanish subtitles or dubbing with it. That is a tremendous amount of data orchestration that you're going to see. And that doesn't happen just in broadcast. That's happening in DVD and digital markets. And as you can imagine, every company, whether it's Google or iTunes and whatnot, has different standards for what they like to see getting to them. And so they could do their work in exhibition. And I could tell you that categorically because Sony was on both sides of that supply chain, both in the distribution and it did exhibition. So it had digital exhibition in Crackle. It had 155 linear channels at the time. And so we would sometimes be delivering content to ourselves. And so you see this kind of like digital supply chains all the way through and has all these complexities, which is drives to this reason why we have all of these data organizations trying to provide standards in media and entertainment. So in media and entertainment, I personally work with more than a dozen standards organizations dealing with trying to figure out how to make this more common, so for us to have common data and for us to really be able to kind of try to interchange data from one to the other. But as you can imagine, that is a hard road. It's been a long road. All of them have made good progress and they're all working hard and it gets us so far. But when you have, just in the US, over 600 TV productions with all of these independent companies every year going on right now, as you can imagine, it's pretty hard to get to standards. So you're going to end up with messy data flowing through the pipes. And at the end of the day, when you get to exhibition, it's got to be right.
Can you give me an example of how your work directly impacts the bottom line in the movie industry? So maybe a story where your work helped push the profit margins for one film or cut costs for another film.
So I'll use as an example, there's this concept, if you've heard it out there, I'll explain it. There's a concept, if you ever hear from media entertainment, called day and date. And what that means, if you ever hear the word day and date, is that the day and the date that a film or a television show is released, it is released everywhere in the world all at the same time. Now, as you can imagine, that has one benefit of kind of fighting piracy, right? So if I can get ahead of the pirates, then I have the opportunity to be first. And then that actually theoretically drives, maybe some more people to actually be in a subscription or a paid for scenario. So that's the general concept, right? I'm in a market, for whatever market is, I'm releasing it. So you could actually somewhat theoretically actually kind of have day and date multiple times. So I could, if it was a film, I could do day and date theatrically, which means it's in every theater or most every theater in the world. We'll put a caveat on how large the market is. And then it could later on be day and date. We're releasing it globally all at the same time in television. And why would it be that it would be difficult to do that? Well, if you go back the step before, if I release it everywhere, it means all the metadata has to be done. It means all of the subtitling has to be done. It means all the dubbing has to be done. All of those steps that you could in the previous world wait and do later. Like, let's get the US product out, and then we'll go make all those dubs and subtitles and fix all the metadata and determine kind of releasing and all of that. So there's a lot of complexity in trying to figure that out. So what I kind of just exposed is actually two things in the same moment. If we use this kind of releasing strategy, being really, really clever and smart about when you release a film, which is releasing, like picking the date. Picking the date is a big deal in the film world. And if I just took a step back and just asked your listeners to imagine for a second, what are all the data points that you would want to know if you were to pick a date? You're going to pick, you're going to be responsible. Let's say Star Trek 20, but Star Trek 20, again, we'll use that example, the most amazing and sought after film of 2020. Okay, you're just going to imagine that, right? And I'm making this up, just making sure everyone knows I'm not broadcasting a product called Star Trek 20, make believe title. So imagine all the information you would want to know. You would want to know, great, when can the film be done? You're going to want to know what audience affinity does it have, and when do they typically go to the theater? You might want to know what weekends have other major films coming out that I would compete against. You might want to know time of year. So I'll use as an example, there are times of year in certain countries, like in Europe, where the summers are beautiful and gorgeous and everyone wants to be outside. People don't stay inside and watch television. And they have different patterns for going to the theater. So there's all of these things about the audience and the product that you would want to know for picking that date. And if I gave you an example of how important that picking that date can be, and this was absolutely a data influenced decision. If you go back, one of the most profitable films of all time, the Sony library, is actually the original Spider-Man. If you compared kind of time and give it a fair comparison in time. One of the best performing films of all time. It set box office records at the time, and I encourage everyone to go look it up. They picked a really clever date, and they were the first ones to do it, which was picking a date before Memorial Day weekend. And no one had done that before. And if you looked at the data and the analysis, you're like, hey, wait, this is actually a really big, long weekend, and it doesn't have a lot of competition. Let's release it then. And going into it, a lot of people thought that was a very strange decision. Now you'll realize, look over the last 10 years, there's a lot of big films now that get released over that weekend. So that weekend isn't as good anymore, as greenfield as it was when they made that original decision. So you can see just in this whole releasing area, just releasing the film, you have both workflow components that are critical for you to play both offense and defense, and you have analytic information for you to be able to make good decisions about when you release the film, and that absolutely can have an effect on the needle. So hopefully that was a good example. I definitely give you a couple others that would certainly kind of make the point about why getting it right is important.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them.
So I had this experience once at Sony, because I was had a horizontal role and I was working with two groups, and I was in a location where the channel operation group and a distribution, it was in a smaller office, distribution group were literally sitting a floor apart, as they had for years, and in through an atrium. So literally you could look up, if you looked up, you could see the person working in the channel operations group could actually see the person in the licensing group above, in kind of two different business units. So the person in the network channel group has now licensed content from Sony Pictures Distribution. You following me? So this is the channel group. They have a channel like ABC, and we'll just imagine AXN, which is one of the Sony channels. And they've licensed content from the distribution group. And maybe we'll use, just for fun, we use a film or a television series that was produced by Netflix, actually, that Sony Pictures was distributing, which is House of Cards. So internationally, Sony distributes House of Cards, which might sound weird today because Netflix does international distribution. But back when they originally produced that show, they did not have a presence in international markets. So they want to make money on it. So they gave it over to Sony and said, great, you guys license it out for us. So imagine you have the distribution group having House of Cards, a channel that wants to license it. They license it now from Sony. And what actually was happening is that the Sony distribution group sent out a package like they would send to anybody else in the world. And even though we had all the metadata and whatnot, but it went kind of through the legal group and the sales group. And when it got to the channel operations group, they literally started over from scratch, like they did if they received any piece of content from anywhere else in the world. And they were like, great, so what show is this? And where can we find the metadata? Oh, we better look that up on IMDb. Let's go find. And literally, the company has every single piece of information ever about this title. And we were having this conversation, and as we were going through this, I'm like, have you ever asked downstairs whether or not they just give you the data? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Maybe, I don't think they give it to us. And so we set up that conversation, and they're like, yeah, sure, you could have the data. And just like that, we were able to kind of make the data flow. But that just is to give you a sense, inside of a company that's very well organized, it's still difficult because so many of the other parties out there just don't operate at that level of sophistication. So those folks that are in exhibition, most downstream, are actually used to having to deal with data coming in from every single source imaginable. And it's all over the place. A big studio probably gives them really good data, and the mom and pop shop that's doing, a production in Budapest, Hungary, may not have the same data standards or even video quality standards. And so the industry has actually created these kind of like data wrangler and asset wrangler positions, and have had that for a long time. So I know that that's something that you see now. A lot of companies, they actually have like a data wrangler or data management team. But these groups have actually existed for a long time in media and entertainment to try to deal with all of the different data they get from all these different sources.
That was Eric Iverson. I'm back here with Mark Marinelli. Mark, any last word that you can leave us with?
The key takeaway for me was how complex the data supply chain really is for media and entertainment, and how balkanized so many of the relevant data feeds are across silos. Everyone listening to this podcast has some degree of data disarray in their organization, but to hear what Eric had to deal with and how he dealt with it brings some confidence that this is a tractable problem. Rather than try and apply a top-down standardization for all these different data sources, which would have been impossible given the level of like fragmented ownership and collection in all of the systems that he has to gather data from, Eric was able to accommodate the variety and gain tremendous leverage for his business by being able to corral all that data together. So I think there's really a lesson in there for all of us, regardless of how insurmountable the challenge may seem and how many different constituents and stakeholders we have in the data, that this actually is doable, and the degree with which we can provide extremely targeted analytic outcomes from all of these data is something I think Eric gave us some high confidence in and some good examples.
Okay, that'll do it for this episode. Thanks to Eric Iverson for sitting down with us, and thank you, Mark, for your insights.
Thank you.
This has been the Datamasters podcast from Tamer. Thanks to everybody who's listening.